Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. As I have said previously, I think this is actually one of the most ill-conceived pieces of legislation that I've seen in the 9 years that I've been here. And it actually, I think, requires more than our consideration as to whether or not this is good public policy. I think we need to look realistically as to whether or not there's a real conflict of interest for people voting on this today. So, Mr. Speaker, for me, because I believe this bill could directly impact my campaign committee, and I believe that this bill has a substantial financial interest in this matter, I must therefore recuse myself on voting for this bill.
This bill could directly impact my campaign committee. And by the way, your campaign committee too, and the campaign committee of every politician that's in this room right now. Therefore, I believe I have a substantial financial interest in this matter, and I must recuse myself from voting on this bill.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this bill, for the first time in the history of our state, and probably the first time in the country, allows your campaign committee, Mr. Speaker, to collude with corporations, with committees, with millionaires, without any disclosure to the public. That's what this does. It's unethical. Every person in this body has a substantial financial interest in this bill, and what the law in the state of Wisconsin is, when that's the case, you must recuse. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill could directly impact my campaign committee and every campaign committee in this room. Therefore, we all have a substantial interest in this legislation. Every person in this room has a conflict of interest and should recuse themselves, and that is what I am doing now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I as well, after seeing what's happened today, even with the amendment that's come through in the 11th hour, this has turned into a circus. But the most important thing about what we're doing today is this bill, if it passes, pads the pocket of every legislator here. It's going to help me financially by passing this bill. I now can have my supporters double what they were giving me before. That's a conflict of interest. I have no right to vote to have increase in payment to me, and therefore I have no choice, because this is such a self-serving bill for the members of the legislature. I have to, in good conscience, recuse myself. Mr. Speaker, this bill could directly impact my campaign committee. Therefore, I believe I have substantial financial interest in this matter, and I must recuse myself from voting on this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It would have made a whole lot of sense if we could have delayed this until January 1st, 2017, right after this election cycle. Because, yes, while the gentleman from the 63rd talked about other things that benefit us individually, had we waited until this election cycle was over, it could have been a little more palatable for those who want to digest a bill like this. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill could directly impact my campaign committee. Therefore, I believe I have a substantial financial interest in this matter and must recuse myself from voting for this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All right. Mr. Speaker, this bill could directly impact my campaign committee. Therefore, I believe I have a substantial financial interest in this matter and must recuse myself from voting on this bill.
Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Speaker, I also wish to recuse myself. I have a substantial financial voting on this will have a substantial financial impact, interest, and affect my campaign committee. But I also have a second reason, in that the way this law now allows unions and corporations to directly participate and contribute to my campaign. As a labor arbitrator, I receive money from both unions and corporations and have in the past. So they feel I have a substantial impact.
Mr. Speaker, this bill could directly impact my campaign committee, which directly impacts my job here. I have a substantial financial interest in this bill, and therefore I must recuse myself.
Well, first of all, I would never be able to support this bill, but I'm in a position now, since it certainly impacts my financial interest in my campaign committee, I would have to choose to recuse myself, and I encourage my colleagues, because I think that we're all in the same boat here, so I'll recuse myself from this vote. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I believe that it is fundamentally unethical for any elected official to vote on a bill that has such a substantial financial interest on his or her reelection during the current campaign cycle. Mr. Speaker, this bill could directly impact my campaign committee. Therefore, I believe I have a substantial financial interest in this matter, and I must recuse myself from voting on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, this bill could directly impact my campaign as well. Therefore, I believe I have a substantial financial interest in this matter and must recuse myself from voting on this bill. I also personally find this bill morally reprehensible. Thank you.
I think it's important that we really focus on ethics, and the gentleman of the 63rd talked about representing your district, and I couldn't agree more that it's important for me to make a decision when it comes to really recognizing that ethics could be at threat here. So I want to be clear that I believe directly this bill could impact my campaign committee, and therefore I believe I would have to make sure that since there's substantial financial interest in this bill, that I'd have to recuse myself from voting. I think it's important that if it's likely to affect a number of our districts, that it's likely to affect the rest. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As a progressive Democrat, I rise, and I'll make my statement in a second, but to the gentleman from Waukesha County's point, there is a substantial difference between the bill that we have today and bills that we've had in the past. And when politicians seek to make the rules under which they get themselves hired and rehired, it is a conflict of interest. It is a personal conflict of interest for a politician to rewrite the laws to favor themselves. And because of that, and because of the fact that I have a campaign committee, and I believe that this bill could impact that campaign committee, I believe that I have personally a substantial financial interest, and I must recuse myself.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I'm absolutely representing my constituents. I am not abstaining. I am recusing myself. After 9 years on a school board, I know it is my absolute responsibility when there is something that gives me personal privilege and financial gain, I have to recuse myself. We had the opportunity earlier to put this off for another biennium, but no, we chose to do it now. I recuse myself because my campaign would have substantial financial interest in this matter, and I do recuse myself, and I am absolutely representing my constituents by foregoing my interest for theirs.
You would vote on pay increases for the next term. Under our law, you can't vote to increase your pay while you're in office. So I think the gentleman from the 11th tried to address that with his amendments by saying this would kick in next term. If you made this apply, Mr. Speaker, the next term, you would address that issue. But by having it apply this term, you have a problem. Just like we couldn't just sit here and have a vote next week to increase our pay this term. It, Mr. Speaker, needs to happen on January 1st, 2017. I also find it ironic that you're all about to vote to index campaign contributions, and I could only get one of you to sign on for indexing the gas tax. Seriously. You guys don't want to address our transportation funding in this state, but you want to line your pockets by doubling contributions. That's going to look great for your constituents when the snow piles up and the potholes are huge after the snow goes away. You can explain to them why you wanted more money in your pockets, but you don't think the roads needed that much attention. Mr. Speaker, I am now back to this bill could directly impact my campaign committee. Therefore, I believe I have a substantial financial interest in this matter and must recuse myself from voting on this bill. Thank you very much.
Mr. Speaker, this bill could directly impact my campaign committee. Therefore, I believe I have substantial financial interest in this matter and must recuse myself from voting on this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, first of all, I'm going to recuse myself because this bill could directly impact my campaign committee. Therefore, I believe I have a substantial financial interest in this matter and must recuse myself from voting on this bill. And, Mr. Speaker, it seems to me that others in this building should be recusing themselves at appropriate opportunities and times as well. Because our Supreme Court has had a couple of folks on there that voted on a bill, on a case, and they clearly should have recused themselves, Mr. Speaker. Secondly, there's a lot of people laughing in this room. Well, let me explain something to you. There's nothing funny about usurping the republic. Nothing. Nothing funny about usurping the republic, changing laws on a whim, redistricting in a way that you functionally are trying to have a one-party system in this state. This is not a laughing matter. And what we're doing here is the ethically appropriate thing. Grow up.
I hope you were paying attention yesterday, Mr. Speaker, as our newest member took an oath of office. I've taken it 7 times. Each of you took it last January. Did it mean anything to you? The words in there require that you serve democracy with an ethical intent. There is nothing ethical at all about this bill allowing unlimited contributions from individuals and corporations to your campaign accounts. There is nothing ethical about removing disclosure and disclaimer requirements. And there's nothing ethical about making it legal to coordinate with special interest groups and your campaign. We indeed are opening Wisconsin for corruption with this bill, and I want no part of it. I am not going to not vote. I am going to do the ethical thing that I am required to do by that oath that I took, that I believe in, that means something to me and to my constituents. And I'm sorry for your constituents that you don't feel the same way, because this is going to benefit you and your campaigns directly, and there is no denying that. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill could directly impact my campaign. Therefore, I believe I have a substantial financial interest in this matter and must recuse myself from voting on this bill, which is not to say I'm not voting on this bill. It is to say I recognize that I may not vote on this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you with an ethical and moral obligation that has bestowed me by the people of the 48th Assembly District to bring their voices to the legislative process for the state of Wisconsin. This bill will directly impact my campaign committee. Therefore, I believe that I have a substantial financial interest in this matter, and I must recuse myself from voting on this bill. And I encourage everyone else to think carefully and read the legislation that has been presented to you and know what it is that you are doing today. This impacts every single one of us in this room. This is a shameful day for the state of Wisconsin.
Mr. Speaker, we tried to fix the conflicts of interest in this bill through the amendment process, but you have rejected each and every one of our amendments. So that said, Mr. Speaker, this bill could directly impact my campaign committee. Therefore, I believe I have a substantial financial interest in this matter and must recuse myself from voting on this bill.
And for the same reasons many of my colleagues mentioned, We cannot give ourselves a pay raise this session. To do so is unethical. We are not supposed to be changing the campaign laws in midstream to favor ourselves, the incumbent, because we all know there is an advantage to incumbency, isn't there? Very simple solution was offered to this problem. Put it into the next biennium, just like we do with any sort of pay raises or anything that affects our personal benefits here, has to go into the next biennium. And because of that, Mr. Speaker, I do have an ethical obligation to my constituents, not to benefit myself in any way, to make it easier to get reelected this cycle, to change the rules in the middle of the game. Therefore, I must recuse myself from voting because I have a substantial financial interest in my campaign committee. And this bill will have a direct and immediate impact once it becomes law on my campaign committee. Therefore, I cannot cast a vote on this bill. And it is only ethical for every other member of this body under the same circumstances to do the same. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been said that time is money. And while I don't plan on lining my pockets with campaign expense from my campaign account, this bill could directly affect that committee. Therefore, I believe I have a substantial financial interest in this matter and must recuse myself from voting on this bill. Thank you.
I'm not known to be an incredibly dramatic person in this body, but my 8 years on the county board and my years in the assembly have informed me that it's my right and my responsibility to recuse myself in this matter because I believe this bill could directly impact my campaign committee. I believe I have a financial interest in this matter, and I recuse myself from voting on this bill.
We were all elected to protect the interest of the people we serve, the people who sent us here. And taking unlimited contributions from corporations, that does nothing to protect the rights of the individuals we serve. The real reason that I'm recusing myself from voting for this bill, Mr. Speaker, is because it sucks. This bill sucks for the people of this state. And you know what? This ain't the only bill that sucks. The GAB bill sucked. We had a lot of that going on today. And I'm sure next week it's going to be some other bills that suck. But the fact that we're being told that we don't have a right to recuse ourselves, or we don't have a right to not vote on this bill when we've seen what happens every time a bill comes up, it's usually 61 to 36. This bill sucks. It sucks for the people of Wisconsin being here all night and waiting for this opportunity to say that this bill sucks. That really sucked. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill could directly impact my campaign committee. Therefore, I believe I have a substantial financial interest in this matter, and I must recuse myself from voting for this bill, and it sucked.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to hear it's gotten chatty in here, because today I watched as 59 members sat silently doing what they were told as the speaker came out here and melted down occasionally, then disappeared like King Friday in the neighborhood of make-believe. You want to know what's a joke? You want to know what's ridiculous? One guy writes a bill and tries to jam it down our throats in 2 weeks. That's a joke. Goodness. Honestly, not a single one of you could debate anything today because you didn't know what was in there either. And with that, Mr. Speaker, this bill could directly impact my campaign committee. Therefore, I believe I have a substantial financial interest in this matter and must recuse myself from voting on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am here today representing the fine citizens in the 74th District. Not a single one of them asked me to increase the amount of money that's being poured into politics. Mr. Speaker, this bill could directly impact my campaign committee. Therefore, I believe I have a substantial financial interest in the matter, and I must recuse myself from voting on this bill. Thank you.
And after 23 years, this is new to me. I've seen better bills. But I too would like to recuse myself from voting on this bill. This bill could directly impact my campaign committee from a financial perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this bill could directly impact my campaign committee. And my campaign committee spends a lot of money saying really nice things about me, and they try to convince the voters to vote for me. And then if the voters vote for me, I get this job and I make $50,000 a year. So because of that, I figure that I have a substantial financial interest in this matter, and I must recuse myself from voting on this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For reasons similar to those given by my Democratic colleagues here tonight, I feel an obligation to recuse myself from this vote. Thank you.
This isn't theater, this isn't a circus, and this really isn't a stunt. This is really serious business. I'll never say it as well as the gentleman from the 18th Assembly District or the gentleman in front of me. But as a former school board member, as a former Dane County board member, I know that I must recuse myself. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, this could directly impact my campaign committee. I have a substantial financial interest in this matter, and I must recuse myself. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we had a lot. You're right, gentleman from the 54th, a little chatty in here, kind of like it. I want to be able to talk about something, but what I don't like is this bill, because this bill is a conflict of interest for me. It is a wrong path for the constituents I serve, but because of the conflict of interest, and the question was raised, this is your campaign committee, but as the candidate, if you don't benefit from your campaign committee, who does? So for that reason, the reason that it says that we have an ethical obligation to do the right thing, that's what I choose to do. Mr. Speaker, this bill could directly impact my campaign committee. Therefore, I believe I have a substantial financial interest in this matter and must recuse myself from voting on this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill only benefits politicians, not the people of Wisconsin, and it opens Wisconsin up to corruption. While one Assembly Republican called the debate today a waste of life, the legislation we are debating will be grave, long-lasting, and probably felt for generations to come. Republicans tonight could have chosen to accept our amendments to make this bill effective after 2016 and not change the rules in the middle of the game, but they chose to do the wrong thing in order to benefit themselves and their campaign coffers for this election that's coming up. It's interesting that Republicans are willing to index campaign donations to inflation, but not raise the minimum wage and index it to inflation, something that overwhelmingly voters of this state actually want. I stand up for my hardworking constituents who demand a clean, accountable government and a government that works for them. They do not want more money in politics, and they don't want politicians passing legislation that financially benefit only them and no one else. This bill could directly impact my campaign committee, Mr. Speaker, and every person who's a politician in this room. Therefore, I believe I have a substantial financial interest in this matter and must recuse myself from this bill. Let the record show that Democrats today stood up for clean, open, transparent government. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker and members, I like the way some of the members on the other side helped to make the point, because I believe all of you should be recusing yourself from voting on this bill. There is no question that you have a substantial financial interest in this matter, as we all do. And for those people that really don't understand the law, there is a provision in Statute 1946, and what it says is that if in fact you have a direct financial interest and will benefit, you must recuse yourself. You must recuse yourself. Now, I appreciate some of the statements that were made here. I'm glad that the gentleman from the 97th spoke up, which enabled my good colleague from the 47th to clarify. You could have taken the gentleman from the 11th Amendment. Could have put this off. When you're zeal to get your hands on that campaign cash, you had to ram it through immediately so you'll benefit immediately. Gentleman from the 40th, interesting point you made. You said, well, you can't use it personally. I hope that's the case. I truly hope that's the case. However, be aware that Jonathan Becker, that guy the speaker's been quoting all night, saying he's the foremost authority, he's the guy we should listen to. In his testimony, gentleman from the 40th, he actually believes that potentially you could take the cash yourself. There's a provision in this bill in section 11.1208, parent 3, parent A, that's very ambiguous according to our legal expert at the GAB that you're relying upon. And he said that when it says except as provided in parents B and C, a committee may not make a disbursement and incur an obligation for committee for a strictly personal use. Not clear what that means, according to Jonathan Becker. So I hope it doesn't mean what we think, but when you push through this bill that nobody saw less than 2 weeks ago, you bring in an amendment at the 11th hour, you don't even want to give us time to really review it. Who knows what's in this bill? I know for sure a lot of you don't know what's in this bill. Lady from Beloit, I almost fell off my chair. Listening to your statement that somehow we're going to have transparency now. Honest to God, I honestly don't know if you really have any understanding whatsoever of what is in this bill. And as for a couple other people that made these statements that, for your campaign committee, you know what? I know people that will probably spend money without anybody knowing about it on my behalf. Maybe it's an issue advocacy. Maybe they'll run some substantial dollars. So I may have a very big conflict of interest, and I don't even know about it. That's just part of so many things that are wrong about this bill. I spoke enough on it today, but Mr. Speaker, it's clear to me under section 19.46 in the oath of office that I've took that I must recuse myself from this vote because it could directly impact my campaign committee. Therefore, I believe I have substantial financial interest, and I will recuse myself from voting on this bill.